All right, welcome to another episode of Net Chasers. I'm excited about this episode simply because we have someone who can really dive deep into college athletics, not only when he was a player, a football player at the University of San Diego. So it's good to have a fellow Torero on, but at the same time, all of the ideas that he has been pumping out via his Substack. So I invite you to look at that. So JT Rogan, thanks for coming on. Why don't you give everyone who may not be familiar with your story a 30-second zigzag through your career, but also teeing up, here's the $100,000 question. What is the state of college athletics as we know it?
Yeah, so I've been in college athletics since I was a student athlete at University of San Diego. So I played football there for 6 years for Jim Harbaugh at the beginning of my career. And then Ron Carriger was the coach after Coach Harbaugh left. So did that and then worked with Coach Harbaugh at Stanford in 2010 as a member of his coaching staff. Decided I didn't want to get into coaching. So got back into trying to compete professionally. So tried out for the CFL, the UFL, the NFL. Ultimately got into broadcasting with Pac-12 Networks and Fox Sports San Diego. Then got back into college football, working at Michigan as Coach Harbaugh's Director of Operations and Communications. And then have been in athletic entrepreneurship ever since because I saw where this industry was headed. I saw, very clearly the amount of money that was, being made at all levels by everyone involved, and thought that, support, guidance, and direction would be useful. And the business opportunities would come from that. And so, as we've recognized and diagnosed, we are correct. There certainly is plenty to go around, and advocacy for athletes, and then guidance and thought leadership for executives in the college athletic space is super valuable.
So I'll just kind of toss this out. What's the biggest question that not only athletic directors should ask themselves, but also coaches in this new landscape as it relates to, coming out of the House settlement and then into this next 2, 3, maybe even 5 years of maybe not so much uncertainty, but just this new landscape of how many dollars, but also the constraints that may be around the athletics?
Yeah, so it's a really big, comprehensive, complex question, but let's start with what we know. What we know is that currently athletic departments are awarding up to $20.5 million across their entire athletic department to athletes. 75% of that's going to football, 15 to 20% of that's going to men's basketball. So the rest of the sports are, mostly underfunded, with the exception of, maybe a handful of baseball programs, handful of women's basketball programs. That is basically what's known to be true. That creates opportunities for all of those, non-revenue sports. So we know that's the case. The current operating guidelines for the House settlement suggest that 20.5 number will only marginally go up in the next couple of years to about 21.5 million. And then there's going to be a recalculation in a few years, which is going to drastically bump up that $20.5 million revenue sharing cap because of new media rights deals, additional money flowing into the system through college football playoff expansion, and increased demand for athletics. And so we understand those things all to be true. But the other thing to recognize is that the values in all of these sports have been trending up massively over projections. So Open Doors has been tracking this year over year. And, football has been going up, double-digit percentage. Men's and women's basketball has almost been, rising 75 to 100% a year. Now, whether or not that will sustain itself with the NIL Go and the mandated NIL reporting from outside entities and third-party companies is yet to be seen. But, suffice it to say that your biggest football and basketball schools are going to be exceeding that $20.5 million revenue sharing cap threshold. How they do that and how much that's going to affect the rest of the market is still unknown, but, expect there to be, increasingly more amount of money year over year going forward.
when you're talking about the segment of sports, dollar thresholds and things like that, a question that comes to mind is like, so what is college athletic? Like, what is the mission of college athletics anymore? When we were all in school, it was a little different, and obviously we've gone through some changes. But like, what is college athletics? But also on that same note, do we have to reframe our whole thinking of college athletics?
Yeah, you have to rethink everything about it. And that's not all bad, but it's certainly not all good. And it used to be really about the immersive total student experience. So I was of the opinion, and still am, that college is a place to develop spiritually, socially, academically, athletically, really the total person. Now it has turned in, much more to the minor leagues, right? Kind of the launching pad to professional sports in football and basketball, especially. But it has been that way for tennis now more and more. You're seeing, athletes like Ben Shelton, August Holmgren from USD, people who are really starting to shine bright, very quickly after their, college athletics career ended in tennis. Or you're starting to see these golfers go from college to thriving in the pros early on. Nick Dunlap was a rookie who won a tournament last year, one of 3 rookies to ever do that. Phil Mickelson was the other one. I don't remember who the third was, but you're starting to get better and better athletes earlier and earlier. And so it is turning into a different model by sport and a different recruiting process for the coaches who recognize that they need to win now, or their livelihood could be at stake. And that is part of the issue, and part of the reason why the deprioritization of high school recruiting has happened so many times, because the leash has gotten shorter, the buyouts have gotten higher, and the expulsion of good coaches and not giving them a long enough leash to be able to prove whether or not they can win and develop culture inside of a program. All of those things are affecting kind of this new reality of college athletics as we now know it.
So, so we've gotten some feedback with our first few shows. Should football be on its own? That's the first question. But then also, and I'm going to kind of categorize them as the Olympic sports. Where should their thinking be? I mean, you brought up 2 very good examples of how those athletes can thrive, but in terms of money allocation, it's 2 very different segments. So where are your thoughts, or what are your thoughts? I know you've written on a few of these subjects, but where are you with the future of football segmented on their own, but then also these Olympic sports, their mindset, their revenue, generating activities? Like where are we with those?
The priority for Power 4 athletic departments is almost universally football. That's what they're focused on, maximizing, generating the most attention for. So that definitely works as a disservice to the Olympic sports, which is criminal if you're talking about wanting to develop elite talent. And It continues to work as a detriment, because there becomes an imbalance where Duke, for example, is so focused on basketball, but is now really focused on football. They've paid Darian Mensah, their quarterback, $4 million a year for 2 years. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. But that means that all of the other elite sports are not going to necessarily be as well resourced. And it then turns into, what's your alumni community capable of fundraising, or what dollars can your athletic department help facilitate through their multimedia rights partner, through their apparel partners, to be able to divert funds back to the Olympic sports. And there becomes a competitive imbalance. And so you're seeing Oregon start to really level up in sports where they maybe otherwise weren't as competitive. And you just are starting to see that everyone went, 4 years ago to schools based on the relationships with the coaches and how they felt like it would allow them to compete at the highest level. And now it is not about coaching staff and talent. It's about, the budget that the gymnastics program can have to be able to fund the NIL interests, or the revenue sharing talents for, that roster. So, it's disappointing that it's unknown and that it's almost forcing the transfer of athletes, because it's hard to say no for an athlete like Najee Kennedy to go from Stanford to Texas Tech, because Stanford conceivably couldn't, fundraise an amount of money that would justify her staying there when Texas Tech was offering over $1 million. And almost in no universe anywhere would anybody ever transfer from Stanford to Texas Tech. But lo and behold, in the NIL era, it happened pretty easily.
Right. So what's the role of administrators and the administration of a school with this landscape of how many dollars are available, but also, this new wave of transferring from program to program?
Yeah, it's a few things, right? There's so many issues, right? So, financial literacy and education around what you're doing with your money when you get it is important. But these athletic departments are strapped for cash. They're cutting staff. They're not able to maybe level up in the way through professional development that they were previously. So it's forcing people to reskill or to, develop new aptitudes and abilities to the best of their ability. They have to wear even more hats than they did before. So one is financial literacy, but then there are all of these other ramifications like, Title IX. Like, you should be advocating for equality amongst resources on the distribution of gender, or the opportunity to have access to resources based on gender, because that's what the university has done, for for the history of time, with the inclusion in the NCAA. And then now all of a sudden they're deciding, well, this is a really important resource, so we're actually just going to dedicate it mostly to men. Like that,
Right.
That's not right. Also, you should be paying attention to international athletes. They're on student visas. They're not allowed to collect, active revenue, active income, revenue sharing payments, or anything of the like to somebody on a student visa is very likely a violation of the terms of their student visa. It's not something that anybody's going to come and revoke their student visa for, but in a couple years, if they go to apply for citizenship and somebody looks into their history and track record, and it's under a super vigilant deportation president like President Trump, you might have difficulty on your hands. And so, either finding a way for funds to be distributed to the athletes as passive income, or in a permissible manner, or encouraging them to be here on an extraordinary ability visa. Like, there are so many different issues that are presenting themselves right now that, keeping the student athlete is at the center of your ecosystem and decision-making nexus is really hard, but you'll be able to rest your head on your pillow at night knowing that you've done your best. If you're really championing for equality and all of the things that the NCAA has ever purported to stand for.
So I know you work with a few ADs. If you were advising a first year AD with the landscape that it is, with the changing laws and regulations, what would be the single most important action item that AD has to either fulfill, fill, or do in their first 90 days?
Yeah, I would say fundraising is the most crucial. So I would develop the tightest relationships, or seek out the most, the highest volume of counsel you can from the most important people, from a fundraising standpoint, because what's going to happen is that if you can involve them in the process of supporting your programs financially, it's going to allow you to better resource your programs, which allows you to fortify yourself against, people poaching your talent. It'll allow you to recruit better talent, which will allow you to win more games, which will allow you to have happier coaches and to build better programs across the board. Specifically, I would love for a first-time AD to find the easiest way to develop a championship team with a championship culture through a championship coach on campus as soon as possible. Everyone can look to them, and it can really be in any sport. It's more affordable to do it in the Olympic sports, but when I was at Michigan, Carol Hutchins with softball, was just a rock and a source of stability for the entire athletic department. And so while there was turnover in so many sports all the time, having her, as a source of stability that all of the female coaches could lean on, all of the Olympic sports could lean on. Like, there were a lot of coaches that looked to her for guidance and direction. And so she was a great resource that way. And so I really like the idea of being able to have a winner on campus, and being able to hang your hat on that is awesome. Obviously, you'd love to get to basketball and football. Not all Division I schools are capable of doing either or both. And so, having an honest understanding of what the best path forward is for you and for your university is going to be great. And it's going to be easiest if you've got the money behind you to get done what you need to get done.
Yeah, I love that, because it seems so simple to be able to do those two things, focus on the fundraising, get those people in line that can fulfill that, but also get that championship level program and all the strings attached that can be part of that. So what is the role of coaches in that? Let's keep this plan going. So what's the role of the other coaches? But at the same time, what's the tough decision that this AD would have to make in their first few months?
Yeah, ideally the coaches are focused on coaching. So what happens is you get coaches who get burnt out by feeling like they have to be an agent, a general manager, a fundraiser. Like, ideally the coaches coach. That's in their title. So the more stuff you put on their plate, the more frustrated they'll get, and they'll leave, right? So you don't want to have, typically you don't want to have to deal with that burnout and that turnover. But you also, as an AD, need to diagnose the situation and understand if somebody's disgruntled and they come to you with problems, but without solutions, right? Like, for your coaches who want to fundraise, who want to win, who want to do more and be better and bring more to the table, you have to empower them. But again, if they're coming to you with just, issues and complaints and friction, they're also probably going to be, poisoning the well with, some of the other coaches, and they might not be great for their athletes either. Right. So that's broadly for coaches. I really would like for a coach on my staff, or a staff member, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a coach. It can be a DOBO or a director of operations, to understand the value and the landscape in the market of players. So understanding, okay, if I want to recruit an elite high school player, what does it look like? If I want to recruit a transfer player, what does that look like? How am I evaluating that talent? What does good look like? I just don't want a power 4 bounce back, right? Like, okay, are they from here? Are they regionally great? Was there something missing where they were that's going to allow them to be elite with us? I think a lot of people swing and miss in the transfer portal because they don't have a sustained strategy. Ideally, you'd like to have a strategy to be able to recruit and retain your elite players. And so that's going to require, unfortunately, thoughtful retention tools like performance incentives, like multi-year contracts, right? It's going to force you to, have your eyes and attention on different instruments than you ever had to before. And that's where some sort of a general manager or a chief revenue officer, somebody who can help with that, is going to be crucially important. And you're seeing that across Power 4. They install general managers to start with, but like Stanford football's got a former player, and Cal football's got a former NFL head coach, and some schools have former executives, and San Diego State's got a 25-year-old who was with Notre Dame, on their national championship, game run. And so you've got all these different, personas and backgrounds. And so I think you'll start to find a little bit more, homogeneity across the industry as people start to understand what's important, what's valuable, what works. And then specifically to our university community, how can we accentuate that with specific skills, backgrounds, or personas?
Yeah. So you talked about fundraising. You're leading a fundraising tool collective. What are you hearing? I mean, you wrote about this, how the fundraising model is changing, especially for college athletics. So what are donors feeling? Like, where are their behaviors changing? Why are they changing? What is the narrative that, whether it's coaches, fundraisers or ADs, what framework do they have to work from?
Well, I think NIL has wrongly been, crucified as the villain in all of the unsettledness of the college athletics landscape, and really, it's been forced on the NCAA through Ed O'Bannon's lawsuit and bringing about compensating athletes for the use of their name, image, and likeness. But it's got such a negative connotation. It's a 3-letter acronym that's treated like a 4-letter word. It's misunderstood. Right. It's very it's got a negative connotation. So don't fight that uphill battle, right? When you talk about fundraising, you need to talk about fortifying your roster, about recruiting, in our case, University of San Diego, Torero men and women who align with the virtues and the values of our university, who fit our program culturally, who we could see leading us to championships and continuing to win games. And so when you talk about needing help doing that, you don't necessarily have to bog down the donor and how the sausage is made. Very few of them understand NIL and where it's going and where it came from and all of that. And so when you talk about, tuition assistance, or when you talk about, additional funding to support their development and growth as an athlete, I've received essays from full scholarship athletes that talk about the financial burden to become an elite player getting even harder the more success they achieved, right?
Yeah.
Team USA players competing in the FIBA games. Like, it doesn't get easier just once you get to college and you get a full scholarship. Like, the true cost of attendance is either not reported or underreported by over 90% of universities across the country. Like, just to own a car and to have car insurance for a 18-year-old, is super expensive, and to put gas in it and all that. I mean, that's never factored into cost of attendance. It's like they expect you to have a bus pass to eat every meal on campus, so understanding that the real cost of attendance is much greater than it's reported as is probably a good starting point for coaches when they solicit donors and they say, hey, we need to be able to provide best in class extra resources. We can only spend, if you're a tennis coach, 20 hours a week with our athletes. Well, they need to spend time hitting balls, getting additional instruction, traveling, right? They need to go to other tournaments to be able to make the maximum of, $10,000 a year that they're allowed to accept in prize money. Like, there's so much more that goes into the student athlete experience than donors are even aware of, that you need to speak to that, highlight that, and deviate away from NIL and more towards student athlete experience, culture building, retention of top talent, to be able to, fortify us against the villains and the threats that are trying to poach the talent from our roster.
Now, I'm going to kind of play this AD consultant game with you. So you're taking over a program. So an AD's taking over a program where they're not so much a first-year AD. They are an experienced AD, but coming into a situation where let's call it mid-major, non-football. So the revenues are completely different. Culturally, they're taking over a program that, may not have won on the scope, but it has plenty of history in the past. What's your first fix? What's your advantage? But at the same time, how are you consulting this AD amongst staff and how to prep them for this landscape of NIL fundraising?
Yeah, so you have to, make sure everyone understands what the focus is, right? So if you're coming in to take over, a basketball program and you're experienced, you've led basketball programs before, people need to trust and have belief in your vision. And ideally you've, got donor support and funding behind you, like I mentioned as step one, but then, everyone needs to be rowing the boat in the same direction. And so, you are going to want to build a culture of cohesion and camaraderie, across campus. I think about like UC Riverside, right? Like Wes Millett did a good job doing a lot with not much. He had Mike Magpio, phenomenal basketball coach now at Fordham. Some programs are up there, some programs are down. They're doing their best to try and punch up in the Big West despite, limited resources. And so I would say, let's identify what opportunities we have. We're in Southern California, which is a hotbed for soccer talent, basketball talent, baseball talent. Like let's acknowledge that. let's have a strategy. We understand that we're not going to have big recruiting budgets. Let's make sure that we put a fence around Riverside for sure, ideally the Inland Empire, and then to some extent, maybe the people that are under the radar slept on a little bit from, a recruitment standpoint. And then let's really, work on building that brand, gaining awareness, welcoming local high schools to events, giving away free tickets. There are some low cost decisions that can have high impact and really allow you to, elevate the brand locally, then regionally. Nationally, it'll be tough, but if you've got the right leaders in place, you understand who's on the bus, you like who's on the bus, and you're able to make 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah. So what characteristics will allow an AD, an administrator, a head coach, a GM to thrive in today's landscape?
So you can't be like a lifelong manager. So many ADs were able to kind of get experience and skills, throughout their journey to the big chair, and then they just had to manage the athletic department. Well, now managing looks a lot more like leading, right? It's like, how am I generating more revenue through preferred vendors, right? How am I creating new dollars that weren't there before? And so when you think about, how you're going to advance your programs, you need to be inventive, thoughtful, and creative. And you also, again, need to take inventory of what's happened recently. There's been very little in the way of punishment, very little in the way of scrutiny, very little in the way of, hey, you shouldn't have done that, right? It's mostly just the squeakiest wheel getting the grease, the most enterprising and ambitious people, creating the best results for themselves. Like, again, you look at Texas Tech and Cody Campbell, they're the head of their board of trustees, celebrating the fact that, he invested more money into his collective than any other collective across the country. And they've got a super talented football roster this year. Men's basketball is a perennial power. So many of their other sports are on the come up. Softball went to the national championship last year. And so, there's a lot that can be done with the right mindset, a good attitude, fundraising support, and a vision for what that looks like. So you have to be enterprising and a visionary and confident in where you believe the industry's headed. And so, again, you've got to be out of the role of managing, and you need to be more enterprising and, maybe pushing your coaches more to figure out more creative ways to fundraise and to, engage dollars that weren't there previously.
Yeah, you wrote about how incentives might be eating the, from inside out. What do we have to keep an eye on? Where are necessary changes with those incentives? But at the same time, are there anything that we should double down on and to allow growth?
I think that this is steering towards a pro sports model. And so treating the athletes more like professional sports contracts, to me, makes sense, right? So to the extent that you're able to do it and your university feels comfortable with it, multi-year agreements, right? Again, back to Texas Tech. They signed a tackle to a 3-year deal for $5.1 million in football. I understand that mid-majors aren't doing that, but understand that that's being done, right? That people are being vigilant in fortifying their roster. They're using new instruments, new tools. There are incentive contracts, like performance bonuses, so to speak. You can't call it that necessarily, but you can even tie that to players coming back to the program. And so you can't just bury your head in the sand. You need to be focused on what are the ways that athletes are being retained by their schools, and how do I do more of that? And then as you look at your professional journey, if you're not getting the support that you need from your athletic administrator, you're going to be banging your head against the wall. You saw the head men's basketball coach at Maryland leave for Villanova because Villanova has a Division I, FBS, caliber basketball program, but has an FCS, football program that's very clearly playing second fiddle. And so there are coaches out there who are not going to be under-resourced, who do not want to be, diminished or minimized. And so understanding that, sometimes it might look like a lateral move going from mid-major to mid-major or from high major to high major. But you saw it with Jimbo Fisher. He went from Florida State to Texas A&M because he felt like he had more resources in Texas. I looked at, baseball coach Jason Kelly went from being head coach at Washington to assistant coach at Texas A&M because felt like being in the SEC, he would have better resources and he'd be able to, be a part of a championship program that way. So, again, as an athletic administrator and general manager, understanding what the landscape is and then how to fortify yourself again against poachers or to give yourself the best chance possible in the recruiting landscape is imperative.
So you talked about some movement and just some title changes. Well, ADs are also doing that. They're going from, sitting in that chair to now Power 4 deputy. Well, what do you make sense of that for us?
Yeah, not only that, they're recognizing their value, right? And if I'm going to have to scratch and claw and do my best at a mid-major, I'd rather just go to where I'm, a lower rank, but more well-resourced, similarly compensated, and able to do that at a Power 4 school. The other thing that you're seeing is guys like Bubba Cunningham being like, I don't want to be here anymore, but I like collecting a paycheck and I'll stick around as like an athletic director emeritus for a couple of years. So people are like, I'll phase out, but my institutional knowledge and my ability to guide my successor is going to be really important to the university. And I kind of like collecting a check and I like being a part of the university environment. So I'm going to extend myself until 2030. And generally that's being accepted with 2 thumbs up because nobody knows what the future looks like. So people are taking advantage of the fact that they've had to endure these 4 years, in NIL, navigating all these uncertain waters. But in the same way that college coach contracts have taken off, in football especially, like you can't go from being a P4 position coach to being a FCS head coach like you used to be able to, right? Or even a low major head coach, right? If you're a coordinator at, elite Power 4 schools, you're making 7 figures. And then it's really hard for a mid-major or low major FBS football program to pay you, what you were making at that school. And so the imbalance is starting to create, flight or a different career path. Like you're starting to see maybe, more candidates who are either outside of the industry or candidates who are already on campus who are just getting promoted from within because the cost of going through a search, moving somebody there, the time, the difficulty, the lack of institutional familiarity can be overwhelming for some people. So it really is fascinating to see kind of the 2 different divergent paths where schools are either hiring, athletic CEOs or they're promoting because of the limitation of, the different pathways and what they feel like they can get out of the candidates.
Right. Do you think that will hurt or does it hurt the non-football, smaller school?
It's just going to force the school to be more bottom line oriented. And that is going to put restrictions and limitations on Olympic sports and the non-revenue sports. I've never liked the term non-revenue because very clearly they're bringing in revenue. It's an unfair label and a misnomer. So I've never really appreciated it. And I understand the sentiment, but again, technically it's not accurate. So it shouldn't be used, but I digress. But you're going to be so focused on football and men's basketball. And that's why I mentioned the Title IX issue. Like that's very clearly something that needs to be addressed. And I expect litigation will handle that. But everybody is so focused on, Graham Rossini said it at Arizona State, like the best way for all of our programs to be great is for football to be great. Well, it's like kind of, but if we're not going to have training table for men's and women's tennis because we're worried about cutting out a $15,000 budget line item so that we can get, 1/10 of 1 year's payment to a backup left guard on the football team. Yeah, I don't know if that's actually better for men's and women's tennis, right? So people are taking the long, deep bow and saying the right things publicly. But I really do like the athletic administrators who are, going to be supporting the Olympic sports and recognize that not every single cent needs to be directed to football and men's basketball in order for the athletic department to be successful.
So where's college athletics going to be in 5 years? Like if you had to put that, wizard hat on, where are we heading?
Well, it's working towards a professional model. So I think, at
Yeah.
some point the athletes get representation, whether that's unionization, collective bargaining, all of that needs to happen because, though they're getting handsomely compensated, they're getting railroaded at, different turns, including, agents taking 20% of their contracts, right? Like that would
Yeah.
never fly
Yeah.
at the professional ranks. And so the money is the system is losing money, which isn't to the benefit of anyone, right? Like if you're making $5.1 million and somebody's getting 20% of that contract, probably Wasserman or Excel or a big agency, that's $1 million that the school's not able to pay out additionally in rev share, that the athlete is not receiving. That is creating a massively inefficient marketplace.
Yeah.
So once you start to allow collective bargaining and you start to create a professional model, you're going to see just a better treatment across the board. You're going to see a higher retention of coaches and athletic administrators because there's less of a disorientation and less of a feeling of all of the shadowy figures and the people operating in the areas of gray, taking advantage of both sides of the equation. So I'm looking forward to representation and people maybe calling a spade and calling this professional athletics. But the biggest opportunity is really like the preferred vendor network. Anytime the incentives are super big for, people to win, whether that's college sports or politicians, you start to see this kind of preferred vendor economy show up, right? So in politics, you're going to work with the landscaping company that supports your political party or gives you kickbacks. You're going to work with the paving company. You're going to work with the labor source or the consultants. And so increasingly, especially at the mid-major levels, because they're only just getting there, the FBS level has been doing this for a long time, is like the CEO of Kroger supermarkets is a Kentucky alum. He is choosing where to ship those groceries based on a shipping company giving money back to the University of Kentucky Athletics, right?
Mhm.
Because there are companies that are willing to do that, and they'll do that for paving, and they'll do that for merchandise, and they'll do that for freight, and they'll do that for travel, and they'll do that for all of these different things. So you're going to start to see companies that were created with an eye on NIL and with a conscientiousness on give back, and taking margins and fees that were previously assigned to travel agents or that were assigned to middlemen and brokers to then be reassigned back into the athletic ecosystem by way of collective or agency or directly through the athletic department. And so there's just going to be a greater value placed on new dollars being created, and then vendors who are conscientious of that and who are capable of making that become a reality.
That's very interesting, and that's that. I mean, there it is, right there. I just wonder where that's going to go, and then who's not policing it, but who's going to at what point? Where's the structure to kind of corral that? So on the same 5 year outlook, what are some false assumptions of that outlook? Like, what are things that we might be worried about in our brains, but we don't really have to worry about that, or what?
Yeah.
What shouldn't we?
I
What
mean,
should we be okay with?
the biggest false assumption is that $20 million is going to athletes. Texas Tech paid their football roster $50 million this year. I mean, that'll be the price for an elite football roster. The price for an elite basketball roster is probably $20 million. So the assumption that it's going to slow down or that revenue sharing is somehow going to limit or suppress the amount of money in the system is just wrong. It's been going up, almost at a, parabolic rate over the course of the last 4 years. What it is doing is it's allowing the schools to distribute the money, have more of the control, more of the say. But ultimately, I just am not of the belief or the opinion that the money is going to slow down because people continue to want to win. And, they've already front loaded contracts at the beginning of this year. And I've been on this on all sides of it. I've worked with athletes. I've worked with parents. I've worked with coaches. I've worked with athletic administrators. I've run a collective. I've been in it. Right. And when I saw a Division II honorable mention football player get hundreds of thousands of dollars front loaded to go to a Power 4 school, like that's where they're going for talent, that money is not going to reduce. It might shift around a little bit. You might see, some programs level up their commitment. You might see some programs drop down, but ultimately, it's going to get recalculated in a few years, and the money's going to go higher, and then it'll get recalculated a few years after that. The money's going to go higher again. And if we're aware that Charlie Baker is a professional politician, and this whole his whole aim after Mark Emmert was to try and get an antitrust exemption so that the NCAA can operate however it chooses and pay athletes in whatever way they see fit. That's just not a reasonable assumption at all, because it very clearly violates antitrust laws. And I expect that in the event that it makes it to the Supreme Court, that you'll see athletes retain their rights to negotiate their labor rates. And again, that's where the collective bargaining and the equality will, find its way back into the system. But I do think it's curious to think about NCAA, what it looks like going forward, the college football playoff. Now that you've got an enforcement arm in place with the College Sports Commission, does the NCAA have much value in its existence anymore? Is it pivoting, what it does and how it serves athletes? And is it capable of pivoting because, the money's getting taken, maybe out of their pocket and repurposed for support of different entities and different institutions?
Right. Well, a couple more questions for you. You've been recognized as a leader in this space, the NIL space. So what responsibilities does that bring to the table for yourself?
Yeah, just education and advocacy for anyone who cares to have it, right? Like, I was all too happy to talk with you. I stand to benefit by more transactions taking place in the NIL ecosystem. But I certainly would say that, the amount of time that I've poured into this, right, and talking to high schoolers and parents and 0 stars and 5 stars and everywhere in between, I think just about everyone who's met me will tell you that, my heart's in the right place and that I truly want what's best for the student athletes. And so I'm not taking 20%, right? Like when I represented, help to consult, athletes, I'm like, well, what are the worst parts of working with agents? It's like, you have to fire them at some point, they want their money up front, or they take too much of a contract. And I'm like, pay me 3%, fire me as soon as it's done, and pay me when you get paid, right? It's like, that to me seems more reasonable and like, being the anti-agent. So, I want to continue to, source good places for information, be involved in the ecosystem, have conversations, and continue to grow and develop with the industry as I have for the last 4 years, and continue to be an advocate for what's right and what's fair.
I love that. And before this last question, I just want to acknowledge the work that you do. I think your articles on Substack are amazing. I think they're so informative, short and sweet, but it uncovers and unpacks exactly where we are, but also you have this lens of where we are heading, and so I acknowledge that, and always supportive of not only your way of thinking, but I think you have a huge advantage coming with you because of all the hats that you've worn. So in that spirit, the last question is kind of a fill in the blank. The future of college athletics is blank because blank.
Yeah, it's uncertain because of ongoing litigation. There are so many lawsuits that were brought about because collectives were marginalized through the NIL Go process. Athletes, primarily University of Oregon, they brought, a suit before July 1, but they recognize the marginalization through Title IX that way. Immigration attorneys, and immigration or international athletes can't even get clear direction on whether taxes should be taken out, how to receive the income, what's the nature of the payment, who's receiving it, all of these things. So, that's the biggest thing that, time will tell. And it took litigation to get us here. It's going to take ongoing litigation to get us to where we need to be in terms of stability. And so I have no idea what it looks like, but I've already, spoken pretty vehemently and clearly about my belief that Title IX absolutely should be part of the equation, because you can't just selectively choose what is Title IX and not Title IX compliant. And then also for internationals, right? We're doing them, in my belief, a disservice by not being more prudent in how we pay them. And some schools are taking note of that. Some schools are more apprehensive about what they're capable of doing with international athletes, which is unintentionally limiting their opportunities, which, depending on your politics, maybe you think that's a good thing. Maybe you think that, we're the land of the free, home of the brave, and that all of our college athletics opportunities should go to us. But, in the event that you believe that we're, a global ambassador for good, as, the U.S. Navy would tell you our tagline is, then, maybe we should do our best to, foster positivity and enthusiasm around our platform for social and athletic improvement across, college athletics and college campuses across the country.
No, that's great. Well, JT, I appreciate the time that you've given us. I mean, obviously, this is kind of an upstart conversation that we're trying to have here, but I want to thank you for coming on. To those of you who are out there, if you're on YouTube, please subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts, follow. New episodes drop every Tuesday, and we will see you on the next time that we are together. Thank you.